It's a huge competitive advantage to have capability. And people, if you think about L&T for example, the capability of execution is so strong that people will give jobs to L&T not just because of the brand which comes from the people's execution abilities, but the reliability, the credibility and so on. So capability is a very, very important, shall I say, competitive advantage that an organization in order to face competition. And investing on capability therefore is extremely important. The problem is that people find it difficult to measure capability. You have assessment centers and you have development centers and things, but to measure it is a challenge, and therefore maybe people give it a bit of a stepmotherly treatment. It's not yet, as Joy was saying some time back, it's not yet reported in annual reports and so on. But my dream and aspiration is that HR should get a chartered status. Now I'm saying something which is a little controversial, so if you want to challenge that, you can. I tried it some time back. I was working on that. Why is my voice going up and down? Anyway, I tried it some time back. It petered off. But I think just like, let's say, a chartered accountant's job or a SCWA, my view is that HR should also have the kind of credibility to sign in an annual report that certain competencies have been achieved. And the metrics should be very clearly articulated. So it's a very important part of a business proposition. And it's not just fashionable to say that, capability and competence are the bedrock for an organizational strategy. It's essential. That people are going to push off. Because if you create a leadership pipeline, let's say there's some organizations including L&T and HCL and others, where people have gone somewhere else and have been good ambassadors. But just because you're equipping them with competencies, that's only one sort of factor which may make them leave. There may be a host of other factors that also prompts them to leave and look for another opening. I don't think it stimulates the person to leave. On the contrary, if you ask me, it acts as a very powerful glue because you're enhancing the CV and people will, there is what I would call as a culture premium, which you can fix for the competency and the capability building. If the organization is in a perpetual state of, upping the competencies of people and specifically people who need those competencies. So I would say it's a very myopic view to say that my people are going to leave if I train them up. If you buy them up from another organization, they're going to be enormously expensive and they create parity problems. So therefore, investing in them is very, very important. And I think it's worth taking. I think the risk is minimal. By the way, I forgot your first question. I think companies are increasingly talking about risk management frameworks where capability and competence and using them interchangeably are a very important part of the organization's future and present. The shareholder would like to look do you have archaic kind of competencies, or are you building them up? Do you have a system? Do you have a framework? Do you have the infrastructure to continuously train your people? Because the skill redundancies are very, very high these days.
Makes perfect sense, sir. We also start looking at a particular use case when we talk to our clients on identifying high potential cohorts.
I don't want to offend anyone here, but creating cohorts, in my view, is a bad idea. People who belong to a particular service, and I'm not trying to make innuendos about large conglomerates which have delineated people into certain services. But if people start walking on water, and if you look at the empirical evidence, the number of people who get into those cohorts who become the real leaders of the organization are far. So what we decided in L&T is that we will be very subtle about how we train and identify the hypers. Rather than calling them out, they would be emerging from the milieu and doing much better with accelerated promotion and so on. But you don't have to have a special tribe of people. The other is, I'm reading a book, and I want to share this with you. It's an old book. It's 1972 published. It's called The Best and the Brightest. I would strongly recommend it to you. It's by an author called David Halberstam, who's a journalist. The story goes this way that before that, the Bay of Pigs episode, when John F. Kennedy was called the Irish Brahmin. just like the concept of a Boston train. So these are the elite, Rhodes Scholars, Yale, Harvard, etc. But they all came together and took a decision that defied common sense. And they decided to, mess around with Vietnam just because it didn't meet their anti-communist ideologies. So I would say that while it is important to make a big deal out of hypos and so on, quietly, we should be it's very important in the team that you have balanced people. You may have people, and the definition of hypo also is a little skewed towards, this is the accusation of line managers, of people who can present well, the leadership gravitas, who can explain things well, where they walk, and the extreme is, they have a personality where they walk into a room and papers fly and people stand up and stuff, which according to me is a bit of crap. I think if you look at the conventional definition of hypo, personality plays a big role. In today's context of hypo, I think they're the quiet people who get things done. They may not be the movers and the shakers in terms of appearance, but they're the quiet people, behind the scenes. So creating a tribe of people who are hypos, I definitely say no, don't call them out. Running assessment centers, development centers, silently putting them through an accelerated path, where they themselves, because of their achievements and their performance, are able to illustrate that they are more competent than the others, at least in some things. Last but not least, if you talk to a person called Edward E. Deming, he probably, boxes both out of the stage if he was living. Famous American statistician. He said this kind of a differentiation of creating hypos with ESOPs, which are out of the roof, creating hypos with differentiated salaries, giving them I wouldn't mind a kind of call IT also. So giving them a super accelerated kind of a promotion and so on is a bad idea. Because the reason is it creates, let me use Deming's language, use the word, it creates sparring fiefdoms and it creates unnecessary politics of one group working. And sometimes the acceptance of a hypo, when you call out the hypo in these cohorts, is very less, because the person who slogged it out and not in the accelerated path, aaphi kariye kaam, is the attitude. And non-cooperation, politics stuff. So it should blend like sugar.
Very interesting, sir. Thank you so much for that.
You have to buy. You can't pretend that you're going to, thank you so much. You can't pretend that you're going to, suddenly train a whole lot of people or a leader in competencies. So thank you very much. So I think where there's a domain deficit, and the domain is critical for the future of the business and so on, it's very important. Somebody very close to you and me exactly had that kind of competency, because of which, we had. So domain is important. The second is, of course, if you're a startup and you're new, and the business is coming, there's no question of developing people. Having said that, if an organization is 4 to 5 years old, I would recommend very strongly to invest on the development, invest on the training, invest on the internal pipeline, because when you get a person from outside, there are a whole lot of confusions that happen. One is, of course, acceptance of the person, culturally, the premium that you have to pay in order, because you have to pay 20-30% more, creates parity problems and so on. So make is better than buy, but buy has to be done when you need domain. Buy has to be done when the organization is completely. So I think it becomes like a theme which comes from the thrust of the company, and the stakes are high in case we don't execute well. The liquidated damages, the kind of penalties are extremely high. So the leadership competencies embrace a whole lot of things, but I would say put execution right on the top. So I think it flows from the mission statement of the organization and so on. The strategic themes have to be discussed. They evolve over time, they change over time. But they need to be articulated as a part of the, we have with McKinsey, we work with what is called as the 5-year plan. And we have Operation Blue Chip, and we have an operation which is Lakshya. All these have a very strong element of what kind of capabilities do you need as an organization team. So maybe you can call these capabilities or bracket them under something called archetypes. So you need some people who can run P&L, you need some people who can execute, you need some people who are functionally very good, I think the overarching kind of above all this is execution in the case of L&T. So each organization has its own, I would say, sweet spot or set of sweet spots. There could be an organization which is in the IT industry, let's say chip design, which makes the designers at a particular point of time get that kind of premium. So it also depends on what is the journey, which stage of the journey is the organization.
Got it. So now let's talk about, let's say, so if I look at the story here, we have said, hey, there's a need for a competency framework and a capability building initiative. We also want to align it with some of the key strategic initiatives of the organization. So if I take the next step and say, hey, now what challenges do I have to assess the skill gaps based on this capability framework? What kind of challenges do you see or have you seen in your...
I think challenge number one is these skills and competencies have a shelf. What is relevant today may not be relevant after 2 years. So constantly doing this refreshment or reset and going through the discovery phase of the lexicon of competency is very important. So constantly doing this refreshment or reset and going through the discovery phase of the lexicon of competency is very important. Secondly, the favorite way of arriving at these competencies, Sriram, is you talk to top management and you sort of cull out the competence. That's not the only way. I would do cross-section of people and so on. I've not heard of too many companies running randomized controlled trials, which are very done in pharmaceutical companies and so on. But I would say that RCTs can be run also in competencies. It's dicey, but you can do it where there's an experimental group and there's a test group to figure out and to prove to the shareholders that the people on whom you're investing are doing much better. Maybe there's a waiting period for investing on the others. Example, supposing you're unleashing, let's say, a wave of programs for people in India. You may not be able to do that for people based in America. Many of these IT companies, you have a whole lot of people based in US or England, wherever it is, UK and so on. So you ideally can do the RCT by looking at the experimental and the control group. There are risks involved. It's not exactly like Abhijit Banerjee's Nobel Prize winner economics kind of a malnutrition experiment. But it's an experiment which lends a lot of credibility to the entire process and you can figure it out much better. So what is important is to keep testing whether these competencies are relevant for a particular point of time. The other challenge is fungibility of jobs. I mean, nowadays, a person does 3 or 4 jobs together. Jobs themselves are fusing with each other. Roles are getting fused. What earlier was called supply chain and manufacturing are almost dovetailing into each other. Manufacturing and logistics and supply chain are almost one. So one has to be very careful and not be driven by only the job role, but let's say a general set of competencies that is important for everybody in the organization, and then a build up on that depending on the role. As you go down the line, I think the competencies get much more sharper with respect to domain or with respect to what you can deliver based on subject matter expertise. The other thing is when we talk about competencies, it's very important to divide them just like a wine glass. There's some wine glasses there. So you think of a wine glass. So when you start your career, there is the broad base, like a GET or something. Then you encourage people to specialize the stem of the wine glass. And then you go out into 3 streams. I'm just saying 3 streams, it could be 4 streams in your organization. 3 streams could be a P&L leader, it could be a project management guy, it could be a functional leader. That makes sense for me. But it's very important to start delineating the competencies as general and then the bolt-ons required for a particular stream.
Thank you so much. So,
andragogy is derived from pedagogy. Pedagogy is more pediatric. Andragogy is more adult learning. But first let me delve on your question with respect to some research. I love the work of Jean Lave. Jeanlave. She's written some work. She's written a lot on something called situated learning. What is situated learning? When you go to your sabji wala, for example, or the green or the wet market, if you're living in the south, if you're asking for 3 pav tomato and each kilo costs about 82 rupees, most people who not got a GMAT of 720 would say, let me whip out my calculator and so on. Whereas the sabji wala doesn't. He will instinctively or she will instinctively say 50 rupees or whatever, or 51 rupees. So situated learning is about her research, which is based on people in a particular situation are able to learn. So that's one powerful theory, which is why people have this 10, 20, 70 thing. 70% is on the job, 20% is what you learn because of the role and the concepts and stuff, and 10% is based on your theories and stuff. But I would say that there's Kolb's theory of learning, which is experiential learning, and reflective learning and so on. But nothing like learning by doing. Nothing like learning by messing around. Sometimes you make mistakes. An organization which has a culture which is unforgiving of mistakes, the learning will be very slow. The other thing is, if there is command and control, the learning is going to be slow. But the reverse mentoring, and there's also learning which can happen the other way around. There could be a set of capabilities which people who are digital natives, they call them. I find it difficult to acknowledge that because I'm okay with the computer. But they are supposed to be much faster with their fingers, and they're better in terms of writing algorithms and stuff. So that's what I have to say to your question. I mean, I just talked about Robert McNamara, George Bundy, John F. Kennedy. All the, Capitol Hill can boast of the most, I would say, intellectually skilled people. All were GMAT 800s, fantastic. But they made a mess of it. Except, of course, Robert Kennedy, who stood aside and defied these people and said, I don't agree with this. He said he doesn't agree with his own God. So I think the biggest problem with AI, and let me not give the impression in this room that I am an AI hater or I'm an AI skeptic. The biggest problem is algorithms are made by who? By people. And the bias that can get into an algorithm can be scary. So handle it with caution. There is a particular software called COMPAS. I'm spelling it out because it doesn't have a double S. Was used in the US, and if you go to Wikipedia and look for Compass, for deciding or helping jailers to decide whom to give parole and whom not to give parole. And guess what? The colored people got a very, very bad deal on it. So they found that there was an implicit bias in it, and there's a big case going on even as we speak. So AI is a wonderful thing if it can work for you. AI is great in case you use it as a LXP. L&T has something called ATL and NXT, which works like a recommendatory platform. For example, if I want to buy a D500 Nikon, which is a DSLR, of course nowadays people buy Z8. And you just type in Z8 or whatever it is, and for the next 15 days you'll get recommendations about what are other people buying in terms of mirrorless cameras or DSLR. So a recommendatory platform works as that. Could be if you're searching for, let's say, Young's modulus, you'll get data on that. If you're searching for the self-fulfilling prophecy, you'll get recommendations for the next 15 days on YouTubes you can see and so on. So those are very, very powerful. They're self-paced and so on. I think there's a dramatic change in the way we learn. I don't know whether it happened to you, Sriram, in your time, but in my time it happened. When you pass out of 11th standard, you guys are 12th standard, and then go to college, we learned through fear, or learned by fear, or learned because of fear. We learned because there was a report card, my ears got pulled because of my marks in Sanskrit and Hindi, which were embarrassingly low. But when we come into, the whole thing about competing, we had an A section and B section and C section, which was crap. You were deliberately sort of kept into offense. I luckily got into one of the better sections. And DPS Mathura Road was supposed to be the creme de la creme. Luckily there wasn't a DPS not Mathura Road, but RK Pura. So I was in Mathura Road and I was the head boy. And I wouldn't have made it probably. But doing that it creates fissures, it creates intellectual arrogance and so on. But AI changes the way you learn once you come into adulthood. Let me put it this way, it's competitive till 12th and 11th, and whatever you did. It's competitive through your engineering, it's competitive through your MBA. It slowly dissolves as you get into adulthood. It's more like golf. You're trying to beat your own records. You're trying to learn, you're trying to reflect. You're trying to do better than what you did yesterday. There's nobody else to compare. So I would say AI helps in that. Besides, of course, the little bit of criticism that I leveled about algos that can go on.
No, I completely agree to that part. In fact,
First of all, I think it should be self-propelled. If you're going to impose an IDP on a person, it doesn't work. If it's a derivation of the role which comes out of a Mercer job evaluation, I just said Mercer like a bit. Could be any, hey, any job evaluation that you do. If it jumps out of that, it's boring, it's not interesting. If it is worked out with collaboration with the boss, which is tough, let me tell you, these are pipe dreams. Most people aren't trained in how to handle a conversation where you have a proactive building of what you need to do to get forward. If they spend time, if they spend an hour and a half, at least once in 6 months on that, that's the way to go forward with an IDP. So IDP, to summarize, should be self-propelled. The boss should take an active interest. And third is, if you are running a 180 or a 270 or a 360, it could give some interesting inputs, though I won't get completely carried away by it, because even in these there is a scratch my back. I can elucidate more on that, but after the next question.
Good evening once again. Kashyap here from Tech.
Very familiar, but I know for sure these are in the past and maybe in the present Aisha, where the founder was paying a lot of attention to the developmental journey. Maybe in some ways it also has the correlation with the extent of courage that the person has in delegating to the CEO, who's also very committed to that. I think Emphasis and Wipro, etc. have got full. So I won't make a blanket statement. I think it's, if you take the non-promoter organization, sorry, I'm coming back to L&T, which is more than 85 years old. HR, right from the research that Uday Parikh and TV Rao did, is a part of the DNA. It's a part of the culture. You can't imagine getting into an L&T and not having been trained at least for 15 days in a year. So I don't know whether there's a hard and fast rule. There are lots of enlightened, I say that with caution, enlightened founders who believe that learning and development is very important. I think the directional flow is towards that zone where founder leaders, founder CEOs are finding that to be very, very useful. So ultimately, it depends on the founder's mentality. There's a lot of research done on the founder's mentality by Baines. So if you want to look that up. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Please, on the founder's mentality,
Yes.
Please go ahead. I said it only for you to.
From AntWalk. Okay. Focus. They want to get exit. They want to move to the next exciting area. You see the senior founders, right? I want to do something 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and then set it up. And there are founders who build institutions. They got vision to build. You look at the Airtel, for example. You took the Infosys one. They built. Those guys really focused on capability quadrant. I worked with some of them personally. I'm very close with this. They really spend a lot of time on capabilities. Whereas I've seen some of the founders whose main goal is to, when can I get to exit? When can I get an IPO done and then move on with my life, make my money and go. They're less focused on the capabilities, but more in terms of getting the product done in short term. Okay, there's nothing wrong. You are driven by what your objective is. But people who build it, they have no choice but to focus on capabilities.
Also, these founders, whether it's a founder or whether it's a professional CEO who's on a salary, just to borrow some stuff from Edgar Schein, there are symbols and artifacts that convey very clearly in the organization that there's a belief. Gyanodaya, our Management Development Institute. And now, one may say that brick and mortar is not important today, but they are symbols that you stand for it, which is also very important. When you assess a founder's mentality or his or her interest. These days, of course, it's a controversial point because these days a lot of emphasis is there on edutech, which is on e-learning and stuff. And why do you need brick and mortar at all? But even if it's the hybrid form, you need some kind of a symbol or artifact to signify the importance.
If I can ask a question,
Please.
One interesting thing you asked, you spoke about is capabilities get things done.
very familiar, but I know for sure these are in the past and maybe in the present I share, where the founder was paying a lot of attention to the developmental journey. Maybe in some ways it also has the correlation with the extent of courage that the person has in delegating to the CEO, who's also very committed to that. I think Emphasis and Wipro, etc. have got full. So I won't make a blanket statement. I think it's, if you take the non-promoter organization, sorry, I'm coming back to L&T, which is more than 85 years old. HR, right from the research that Uday Parikh and TV Rao did, is a part of the DNA. It's a part of the culture. You can't imagine getting into an L&T and not having been trained at least for 15 days in a year. So I don't know whether there's a hard and fast rule. There are lots of enlightened, I say that with caution, enlightened founders who believe that learning and development is very important. I think the directional flow is towards that zone where founder leaders, founder CEOs are finding that to be very, very useful. So ultimately, it depends on the founder's mentality. There's a lot of research done on the founder's mentality by Baines, so if you want to look that up. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Please, on the founder's mentality, please go ahead. I said it only for you to.
Okay. Focus, they want to get exit, they want to move to the next exciting area. You see the senior founders, right? I want to do something 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and then sell it off. And there are founders who build institutions. They got vision to build. You look at the Airtel, for example. You took the Infosys one. They built. Those guys really focused on capability part of it. I worked with some of them personally. I'm very close with this. They really spend a lot of time on capabilities. Whereas I've seen some of the founders whose main goal is to when can I get to exit? When can I get an IPO done and then move on with my life, make my money and go. They're less focused on the capabilities, but more in terms of getting the product done in short term focus. I mean, there's nothing wrong. You are driven by what your objective is. But people who build it, they have no choice but to focus on capability.
Also, these founders, whether it's a founder or whether it's a professional CEO who's on a salary, just to borrow some stuff from Edgar Schein, there are symbols and artifacts that convey very clearly in the organization that there's a belief. Your Gyanodaya, our Management Development Institute, and now one may say that brick and mortar is not important today, but they are symbols that you stand for it, which is also very important. When you assess a founder's mentality or his or her interest. These days, of course, it's a controversial point because these days a lot of emphasis is there on edutech, which is on e-learning and stuff, and why do you need brick and mortar at all? But even if it's the hybrid form, you need some kind of a symbol or artifact to signify the importance.